Good morning. The committee shall come to order. I note the presence of a quorum and state that without objection, the chair may declare a recess subject to the call of the chair. Pursuant to House Rule 11, Clause 2, I announce that I may postpone further proceedings today on the question of approving any measure or matter or adopting an amendment on which a recorded vote or the yeas and nays are ordered. Documents, amendments, or motions must be submitted to the electronic repository at hnrcdocs@mail.house.gov from a House-maintained email address. Please note that as with in-person meetings, members are responsible for their own microphones, and as usual, members can be muted by staff only to avoid inadvertent background noise. I strongly recommend that members pin the timer so it remains visible. And finally, members experience any technical problems should inform committee staff immediately. Let me begin with the first order of business today, and that is to welcome 7 new members to our committee on our side of the dais. First, let me introduce Representative Katie Porter, representing the 45th District of California, that joins our committee. Representative Teresa Ledger Fernandez, representing the 3rd District of New Mexico. Representative Julia Brownlee, representing the 26th District of California. Representative Steve Cohen, representing the 9th District of Tennessee. Representative Rashida Tlaib, representing the 13th District of Michigan. Representative Doris Matsui, representing the 6th District of California. Representative Lori Terhan, representing the 3rd District of Massachusetts. We welcome a returning member who served on the committee several Congresses ago, Representative Betty McCollum, representing the 4th District of Minnesota. We are very excited to welcome our new members along with the minority's new members. And for that, Mr. Westerman, you're welcome to introduce the new members of your team. Mr. Westerman?
Thank you, Chairman Grijalva. And before I do that, I want to wish you an early happy birthday. I understand that that's in order with tomorrow being your birthday. So happy birthday.
Thank you very much, Mr. Westerman. Yeah, it's no big party, but
yeah, you don't have to give us a number. I mean, we can look it up, but we wanted to wish you a happy birthday and like to welcome our new and returning members and welcome everyone on both sides of the aisle. And I do look forward to the day when we can all again gather back in person in the committee room. We've all been given priority access to the COVID vaccine, but now all of us have had the option of being vaccinated, as well as many staff members. We know how to conduct business safely in person, just like millions of essential workers across the country do every day. If the work of Congress is essential to our nation, then it's time for us to come back to the Capitol and get to work as soon as possible. As we organize the committee and prepare for the year ahead, we need to start with a bipartisan set of rules that ensures full and fair debate of all policy issues that come before us. Earlier this month, I approached Chairman Grijalva with suggestions and edits to the draft committee rules for the 117th Congress, and I would like to thank the chairman for accepting several of our edits, such as keeping God in the oath, not postponing votes indefinitely, and working with us on forums and roundtables. However, there are provisions the majority insists upon that remain problematic. It's unfortunate we could not resolve these issues with the majority prior to today's organization meeting. We intend to offer amendments now to address the remaining issues and inject necessary transparency and bipartisanship into the committee's rules. Further, I would like to note that while the committee is just organizing today, it's both regrettable and disappointing that the Democrats have chosen to circumvent the legislative process and advance a $1 billion budget reconciliation package without so much as a markup. These partisan actions undermine transparency and accountability, the very things we should be modeling here on the committee. As a result, my colleagues and I will all be offering an amendment to prevent this from happening again and ask for the committee's support. It is my hope that moving forward, we can work collaboratively across the aisle to report our important legislation out to the House, and that we can do what is good for America, our economy, and the environment. As always, we agree on some policy matters and rigorously debate and deliberate on others. Regardless of the outcome, it is imperative that both sides are given the opportunity to have a full and fair debate on these important policy decisions. With that, Chairman Grijalva, I do look forward to working with you and all members of the committee on the 117th Congress to put America and what's best for America first. And I do want to introduce our new committee members, Mr. Tom Tiffany representing the 7th District of Wisconsin, Mr. Jerry Carl representing the 1st District of Alabama, Mr. Matt Rosendale representing Montana at large, Mr. Blake Moore representing the 1st District of Utah, Ms. Yvette Harrell representing the 2nd District of New Mexico, Ms. Lauren Boebert representing the 3rd District of Colorado, Mr. Jay Obernolte representing the 8th District of California, and Mr. Cliff Bentz representing the 2nd District of Oregon. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Of having ended up with COVID, I would like to thank you, and I think our initial discussion about there will be points of disagreement, no doubt, but that civility and professionalism, and more importantly, the debates and substantive debates are going to be part and parcel of what we do, and I hope that we do that in such a way that brings to the entire committee the idea that we can have these debates, we can have these civil disagreements in a spirit that's professional and consistent with what we should be doing as a committee, and I appreciate your overtures as well, sir. Now I would like to name our subcommittee chairs, and then Ranking Member Westerman will introduce his ranking members. The committee has selected 5 excellent subcommittee chairs. Representative Huffman will continue to serve as chair of the Water, Oceans, and Wildlife. Representative Lowenthal will continue to serve as chair on the Energy and Mineral Resources. Representative Neguse will serve as chair on the National Parks, Forests, and Public Lands. And Representative Leche Fernandez, a freshman member, will serve as chair of the Indigenous Peoples of the United States. And Representative Porter, a new member to the committee, will serve as chair of the Oversight and Investigations. I want to thank each of these members for their willingness to serve as subcommittee chairs, their leadership, and their consultation going forward. will be invaluable not only to the chair, but to the function of the committee, and I look forward to it. Mr. Westerman, your ranking members, please.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and we look forward to working with the chairs of the subcommittees. I would like to take a moment to recognize our Republican overall committee vice ranking member, Louis Gomert of Texas, and also our subcommittee ranking members, Mr. Young of Alaska for Indigenous Peoples, Mr. Gosar of Arizona for Oversight and Investigations, Ms. Gonzalez Colon of Puerto Rico for Insular Affairs, Mr. Fulcher of Idaho for National Parks, Forests, and Public Lands, Mr. Stauber of Minnesota for Energy and Mineral Resources, and we also have a freshman ranking member, Mr. Bentz of Oregon for Water, Oceans, and Wildlife. And we as well would like to recognize our vice ranking members, Ms. Rodawagon of American Samoa for Insular Affairs, Mr. Tiffany of Wisconsin for National Parks, Forests, and Public Lands, Mr. Carl of Alabama for Water, Oceans, and Wildlife, Mr. Moore of Utah for Oversight and Investigations, Ms. Harrell of New Mexico for Energy and Mineral Resources, and Mr. Obernolte of California for Indigenous Peoples. Again, I thank you all for your leadership, and I look forward to working with all the members on our side of the dais and the other side of the dais in this next Congress.
Thank you, Mr. Westerman, and I announced that we also, the majority also designated Representative Garcia as the vice chair for the full committee, and Representative Sablan as vice chair for Insular Affairs, and I look forward to having their leadership on the committee as well. And Mr. Westerman, do you have a deputy Republican leader that was introduced earlier?
Yes, that's Louis Gomert of Texas. He's the deputy Republican leader.
Thank you very much, sir. We now move to the adoption of the proposed committee rules. They have been properly noticed, circulated electronically, along with copies of timely filed amendments. Late amendments are also circulated electronically. Without objection,
Mr. Chairman.
Mr.
Chairman.
You're recognized.
Can we have a brief colloquy before we get into the amendments?
I was going to get to that point.
Okay.
Without objection, the proposed rules will be considered as read and open for amendment at any point. Before we continue, I believe Mr. Westerman and I have reached an agreement on an opening colloquy. For the record, Mr. Westerman, please.
Yeah, and thank you, Chairman Grijalva. While some of our edits were not incorporated into the final rules package, I'm pleased that the chair has agreed that the committee will follow these procedures. The first one is that during any remote proceeding of the committee, that members of Congress, committee members, personal staff, and employees of the committee shall have access to the committee's hearing and conference rooms. The second one is in the spirit of transparency and accountability. When the relevant committee staff receives witness testimony and pertinent documents for committee hearings, it will be shared immediately with the Republican committee staff. And I would just like to ask if the chair can confirm that the committee will follow these practices during the 117th Congress.
Several of the ranking members' amendments to our rules package and incorporate them before noticing the rules last week. It is my hope that we can continue in that spirit and continue to find common ground. As we've done it for every meeting when it's been requested, we will continue to open the doors to 1324 to allow members to carry in their laptop and participate in remote proceedings. We ask that you continue. We ask those members to continue to follow the recommendations of the House physician and the CDC to wear masks, social distance, and limit unnecessary contact. House janitorial staff must clean our committee rooms each time they are used, so I encourage members to consider the impact of using the room, but nevertheless, that availability, access and availability will continue. We will also endeavor to share testimony and relevant documents for committee hearings and meetings with all committee members and staff, as has been the practice. Last Congress, my staff would send a monthly schedule of intended hearings and markups exceeding notice requirements. We intend to carry that practice on as well, and look forward to those. Now, before we consider amendments, does any other member wish to be recognized on overall on the proposed rules? And if there is no further debate on the proposed.
Chair, could I ask a question? Webster.
Mr. Webster, for the purpose of the question, sir, you're recognized.
Yes, the House has adopted it's not really gender neutral. It's a little more than that. Maybe some words don't seem to be gender at all, like cousins or things like that. But my question is, are we going to abide by that in the committee? And is it just verbal, or is it written, or both? Do we have to use certain words, titles, so forth?
I think consistent with overall with what Congress as a whole adopted as rules, those they were more than guides. They were, from our side, we will work to utilize and incorporate those words, those identifications per se, and it is suggested and encouraged that be the practice for all. But as we've seen in the past, that not necessarily will be something that'll be followed through.
So you would be chair, is that correct?
Yes.
Not Mr. Chair, not chairman, just chair.
These are not. I will. These rules are not about what people can say out loud, Mr. Webster. But the point being that Chair, Mr. Chairman, those identifications to me are fine. But Chair, for me, I would prefer. But that's entirely up to the person. But these are not things that we're talking about. That are always those rules are the things that are always something that are done out loud. But it's I understand your question, but I think it's kind of a difficult one to answer, given what a person's personal motivation as to where they want to go with this.
Right. So then, but written down, that would be different. So if it's in writing, would that?
If you're asking me specifically, I would prefer chair, and in terms of a written communication, but that is going to be in the pen of the person doing the writing, and we'll go from there. But there is there's no punitive outcome as a consequence of not following those guidelines that are meant to encourage decorum and a sense of equity among members, but that's entirely up to the individual.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome. Is there, if there's no further debate on the amendment before we begin the amendment process, and I hear no response, let me begin now. Mr. Graves, Representative Graves, you're recognized for 5 minutes on your amendment designated as number 1. Mr. Graves.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I didn't want to take up any time during the opening statement, but I did want to, similar to the last Congress, I did want to say thank you for your efforts to work together with Ranking Member Westerman. And in particular, I want to thank you for retaining the portion about the oath. As we discussed last year, I do think it's important for us all to recognize there's something bigger and greater than us, and in God. And I know that it's had a big impact on my life, and I just want to tell you how much I appreciate you doing that. Mr. Chairman, we have Sir, I believe you're on mute, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. If the gentleman would yield just for a second.
Absolutely.
I want to thank you. Based on the debate last year in which we that topic that you're mentioning became the point of contention. It was to me and to members of the majority. It didn't seem. It did not appear to be one in which we would cast all our resources and have a long debate as we did the last time on it. And so we retain what used to be and leave it as that. And I appreciate you bringing it up.
Yes, sir. Well, again, I just want to say thank you. Mr. Chairman, we have amendment number 1 at the desk.
Yes. The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes. Mr. Graves, on your amendment, number 1.
Okay, great. Thank you. Mr. Chairman, this amendment actually returns the committee rules back to previous state. There are 2 important provisions related to transparency, and you just heard Ranking Member Westerman just seek a commitment in the colloquy that the committee will provide witness testimony to the minority as it is received immediately as it's received. This is a similar provision, and I think it really is consistent with that spirit which you all agreed upon. It has 2 different components. First of all, in paragraph 3A3, it would return, and I want to reiterate, return to the rules package a provision that simply says that that 48 hours before the meeting, that the majority staff background memo would be provided to the majority, which would summarize provisions of the legislation that we will be debating in the markup. I think it's really important, Mr. Chairman, to ensure that everyone is informed and understands the intent of legislation, understands major provisions and how those may impact the respective districts that we represent. And so that's the first part of this amendment. And I just want to be clear, this is 100% about transparency, about communicating with all members of the committee and the public to ensure that folks understand the repercussions of legislation under consideration before the committee. The second provision subject to this amendment is it returns 4C. So this would return 4C. That simply says that that the majority staff will make available memorandum explaining the subject matter of a hearing. So the first one would be for markups, the second would be for hearing. All this is about, it's about transparency. It's about establishing a common operating picture among the majority and minority members. And I think it's also going to help the public and really result in us having better legislation, because the more eyes that we have on this stuff, the better common understanding and common operating picture we're operating under. I think it's going to result in the committee delivering better legislation that has the best expert input to ensure that we're doing the right thing for the American public. So I urge adoption of the amendment and yield back. You're on mute, sir. You're on mute.
Is there
you were saying
discussion on the amendment? Let me recognize
Mr. Chairman.
The gentleman who's seeking recognition.
This is Westerman.
Mr. Ranking Member, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want to rise in support of Representative Graves' amendment, and also inform the committee that the minority staff has been instructed to release our hearing memos prior to the meeting. We will post those online, hopefully on Mondays of the week that we have hearings. So we would encourage the majority to do the same, and I ask that everybody support Representative Graves' amendment.
Gentleman yields.
Back.
The gentleman yields back. Let me recognize myself on the amendment. Let me thank the member for the amendment. This amendment would restore some important aspirational language we adopted in the last Congress, having to deal with prior notification, and transparency. I think if the goal is to have substantive debates based on empirical information, some basic rules of civility, then obviously everybody working from this from the initial same set of information is very important. And this amendment, since members feel strongly about this language, I'm fine with accepting the request. I'm glad we reached another agreement on top of the many rule requests that we were granted to the minority. And hearing no further debate on the question is on amendment number 1 to the proposed rules. Let me now pause so that members in favor can unmute. And all those in favor, please indicate by saying aye. Aye. Members would please mute themselves again. I will pause so that members opposed can unmute. All those, give me a second to, all those opposed say no. And the members will mute again. In the opinion of the chairs, the ayes have it. The ayes have it, and the amendment is agreed to.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Graves. Ranking Member Westerman, you have the next amendment designated number 2. You are recognized for 5 minutes, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And this amendment again is to allow us to use the hearing room and use it in a way that's being used by many other committees here on Capitol Hill. I serve on the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee, and when we have our hearings and markups, a lot of members, Republican and Democrat alike, come to the committee room, and instead of having to bring our personal laptops or devices and to do the meeting on Zoom or WebEx, we can actually use the audio-visual equipment, so it's more like a real hearing where we've got the microphones, we've got the cameras, we can still see the people who are on the who are doing it remotely. We can see them on the screens in the room. Our committee hearing room has been used to do these types of hearings in the past. We have the equipment and the personnel to do it. It doesn't require any additional staff or personnel to do the hearing that way. And I think it makes for a much better hearing. And this amendment is simply to ask the committee to allow us to use the audio-visual equipment in the hearing committee room when we have hearings and markups. I yield back.
Thank you. The gentleman yields. Anyone, any member wish to address the amendment that Mr. Westerman has put forth?
Mr. Chairman, it's Huffman over here. I certainly I serve on T&I with Mr. Westerman. Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I agree that it's worked well at T&I in that hearing room. I do know from our experience in this committee, though, that the audiovisual capacity seems to be a little bit different. We've had some terrible echo technical snafus. So in the spirit of what Mr. Westerman's proposing, I personally have no problem with it, but I am concerned about our technical capacity in our hearing room. I just wanted to flag that concern.
Thank you, Mr.
Mr. Chair.
Chairman Grijalvas, Sablan.
Mr. Sablan, you recognized?
Yeah, thank you, everyone, and good morning. It's 2:30 where I am at, and that is one reason, Mr. Chairman, that I hope that Mr. Westmoreland's amendment does not require members to come and be present, because I am really having a wonderful time working at home. And if we're required to be in the committee room, that takes away some of, this pleasure of actually getting to know my family. My wife's happy. Even my 2 dogs are very happy that I'm home, Mr. Westmoreland. Just so it's not a requirement, it's a suggestion. Thank you. I yield back.
Mr. Chairman, may I address that?
If somebody would yield to you, Mr. Westerman, if somebody would yield to Mr. Sablan, yield.
Yes, I do, to the ranking member. Yes, sir.
Mr. Westerman, you recognize?
Thank you, Mr. Sablan, and maybe we could all go to Guam and have a hearing. It's a beautiful place, and and it would be great to be able to get together and do that. This amendment doesn't require anybody to be in the committee room. It just makes the audiovisual equipment available for those of us who choose to be in the committee room. And we have spoken to the House Broadcasting, and they say that this committee room has the capability, the audiovisual equipment, to use like we've done in other committees. I know it's not just T&I that uses the audio visuals in the committee room. So again, it doesn't require anybody to be here. It just gives those of us the option who want to be here to be able to use the microphones and take advantage of the good camera equipment that's in the committee hearing room. So I encourage everybody to support this, and I yield back.
Yeah, thank you. Mr. Westman, I do agree with the audio video. You really do look good on this. As for the Guam visit, we're gonna, and I'm sure he'll welcome us. Mr. San Nicolas would be the person to talk to.
And the Northern Marianas.
Certainly, on that part, I welcome you. Mr. Chairman, are you back?
Gentleman yields. Let me recognize myself. In our discussion, I assured the ranking member that the minority will continue having access and availability to the committee rooms. Minority wants the hearing rooms now to be set up to look more like, frankly, the pandemic is not occurring. This amendment would intrude on the chair and the majority's prerogative to run committee proceedings. More importantly, members should oppose this amendment because it enables and encourages stunts. The House majority is trying to be safe. That's why we have proxy voting on the floor and remote authority now. There is no procedural or legislative or in any way legitimate reason a member needs to be in the hearing room for our proceedings. Insisting on being in the room is a political decision on the backs of people who are sick and dying. It's an attempt to undercut public health advice and pretend that the pandemic is a hoax. The committee will not use its resources so that members can pretend they are somehow tougher, more fearless than people who take the pandemic seriously. We will not use our resources to protect anybody's ego, particularly former presidents whose approach to the COVID was to keep wishing that one day, like a miracle, it's going to disappear. We're approaching 500,000 people. America's dead. And so in the United States, a member has died from the virus, so has a member-elect, and others, members and countless staff have fallen ill. In some cases, likely from exposure to our hearing room. In other cases, from exposure during a terrorist attack and attempted coup. This committee will not use its resources to enable stunts that downplay the severity of this crisis, and it is a crisis.
For the chairman's words to be taken down. This is intent.
I urge opposition to this amendment and yield back my time.
It has to be recognized. The chairman's words should be taken down. He's expressing intent and motive that we believe that this virus is a hoax and that we are tough. I ask the chairman's words be taken down.
I believe that the gentlelady has asked for the words to be taken down. And I believe that my statement was concise in the impression that potentially that acting as if though we were
The chairman has characterized members of this committee with intent, and I ask that the chairman's words be taken down.
Okay, the gentlelady will suspend, and we will suspend the hearing for a second until we get some additional information on the gentlelady's request. She's saying. What was your last comment? Am I on mute?
Mr. Chairman, do we have a parliamentarian available? This is McCullum. Because normally when words are taken down, they are read back by the recording officers on the House floor, which we do not. I don't know how that's working while we're doing that.
Thank you. Let me respond to the gentlelady. We need to have your motion to strike take the words down, put in writing, so that the court, so that we can send that to the court reporter for advice and reaction. And if you would do that and submit it electronically to us, we can respond to that before this meeting's over. But at this point, we need that in writing in order to have that for the record, the words and comments that you want struck down.
I will put my motion in writing. How would you like me to send that to you?
You can send it to the House Committee staff, that is the technical staff, and they will disseminate it to the rest of the committee.
Thank you, Chairman. I'll do that right away.
Thank you. Any further discussion on this amendment? We will hold off.
Mr. Chairman?
Mr. Chair.
Yes,
Graves, Louisiana.
yes, please. Mr. Graves, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I certainly understand your concerns about the health and safety of our capital community, and I absolutely respect that. But Mr. Chairman, I do have concerns about the motivation. I know Mr. Westerman well, and I am confident that there is no intention by him.
I don't understand.
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Chairman,
I'm fine.
I know, but you're not muted. I just want to let you know. So if you
Yes.
start cussing about me, people are going to hear it.
I never cuss about you, Graves.
All right. Mr. Chairman, so I just, in regard to Mr. Westerman's motivation, I am confident that there's no motivation here to show any type of ego or anything else. Mr. Chairman, as you well know, when we're all physically present for a markup, it gives us the opportunity to dialogue. As you know, sometimes things evolve on the fly, new concepts and ideas, better solutions, and the opportunity for at least some of us who choose, people who may be vaccinated, have antibodies or what have you, for them to choose to be present, but at the same time practice safe distancing, practice mask and other things. I think that it can be done safely. Let's keep in mind, people are going to restaurants out to eat without masks. People are going on the House floor in huge masses. And so I do believe, Mr. Chairman, that there's a way for us to do this safely. I don't believe that Ranking Member Westerman's intent is to show any type of disrespect for the virus or its intent, or excuse me, or its ability to kill folks or anything else. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I'd like to yield to Ranking Member Westerman.
Gentleman yields. Mr. Westerman?
Thank you, Representative Graves, and Mr. Chairman. I would like to say that our motives are not to diminish the seriousness of the pandemic, but just to be able to use the equipment that's here when we are here. As members of Congress, we were able to get in ahead of line from even healthcare workers on getting the vaccine, not just members of Congress, but certain staff members. And the CDC guidelines clearly state that after you've had both vaccines, that you don't even have to quarantine anymore. So I think we can practice the precautions and do like other committees on Capitol Hill have done. The committee rooms are used in a bipartisan manner. It's not only Republicans going to the committee hearings, it's Republicans and Democrats alike. So hopefully we could adopt these same rules. And I again encourage everybody to vote for this amendment, and I yield back.
Thank you. Gentleman yields. Members will suspend while we address this motion, and thank you.
Mr. Chairman?
We're suspended until we address this motion, and then I'll address it in a second.
Well, I would like.
The philosophy of not taking COVID seriously. And of course, you come from the perspective of someone who caught COVID in our hearing room. So we can all appreciate your sensitivity on
No,
that
let me-
subject. But if I understood you correctly, that you were speaking broadly about the attitude or philosophy of not taking COVID seriously, I don't think that rises to the level of anything objectionable. And if that clarification were in order, perhaps we could just move on.
No, and I'm ready to move on. I will.
I'm not. I'm not.
I want to
I
talk.
need clarification, and I would like to hear from a parliamentarian because I took great offense to those comments.
Well,
You were in the queue.
yes, sir. Yes, sir. Mr. Chairman, Mr. Chairman, I understand that you had COVID, and Congressman-elect Ledlow, who passed away at 41 years old from COVID, was a good friend of mine, and it was a big loss to this country. And Mr. Chairman, I just lost my dad to COVID.
Sorry.
I don't believe that it was your intent to communicate the words in the way that they were heard from a number of members. And I actually agree with Mr. Huffman. Mr. Chairman, I just ask if you could maybe just take a step back and just try to communicate your.
No,
your intent
I'm ready to
a little
respond.
more clear.
Am I on mute?
I would appreciate it.
Mr. Graves, I'm ready to respond to the request. That was never my intent to impugn the character of any individual on the committee in terms of the motivation. Anything that references intent on my statement, be glad to withdraw that and withdraw the statement. And as such, continue to oppose the amendment on the basis that there are issues relative to the outlay of effort in terms of audiovisual, and that we continue to maximize the level of the lack of exposure, the social distancing that has been recommended, and that continue to be the priority. And for that reason, I would oppose the amendment. That does not imply intent. The only intent is that we continue to play our part in reducing the potential spread of this COVID, and leave it at that. And the other words would be removed.
Mr. Chairman, you are withdrawing your statement, your previous
I'm
statement.
withdrawing my statement, yes, but retaining the opposition for the reasons I just stated.
Mr. Chairman, you need to put your camera on.
If the statement is withdrew within its
The
entirety.
statement is withdrawn. It is not.
If it's
It is.
withdrawn, then
Mr. Huffman and Mr. Graves both made that this would become a point of contention, and if if my personal feelings were part of the statement in terms of motivation, that intent is removed, and my opposition continues to be to the amendment based on our need to continue to play a role and in minimizing the
Mr. Chairman, with the withdrawal of your statement, I withdraw my request.
The request is withdrawn, the statement's withdrawn, the opposition restated goes forward, and any further discussion in the amendment? Hearing no further debate on the question is on the Westerman Amendment number 2 to the proposed rules. I will pause so the members in favor can unmute. All those in favor indicate by saying aye.
Aye.
Aye. Aye. Members will please mute themselves again, and I will pause so the members opposed can unmute. Am I unmuted? All those opposed say no. No.
No.
No. The members will please mute again. In the opinion of the chairs, the noes have it. The noes have it, and the amendment is not agreed to. Representative Gosar, you have the next amendment designated number 1. You are recognized for 5 minutes. Mr. Gosar, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Gosar?
This is a amendment
Am I muted? No, not yet.
designed
Mr. Gosar?
the
We're
rights of all
able to hear you. Mr. Representative Gosar, we're having difficulty hearing you.
Greater community in a green through our oversight and subpoena.
Mr. Chairman,
Mr. Gosar, we're having technical difficulties hearing you, and if maybe we could pause and make sure that everything is working on your end, so that we can hear your statement regarding your amendment. At this point, we cannot.
Still not muted, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Chairman,
Yes.
since we're having trouble with Mr. Gosar's audio, I would ask unanimous consent that we can offer his amendment
At a later time?
now.
Okay.
We have the written amendment.
Let me move on to we'll move on to the next amendment and return to Mr. Gosar's once we figure out what the situation is. Mr. Ranking Member Westerman, you have the next amendment, and you're recognized for 5 minutes, sir.
Thank you, Chairman. And just to make sure that we're going to be able to come back to Mr. Gosar's amendment. Okay. So this amendment deals with firearms in the committee room, and this is an amendment unique to our committee. No other committee in Congress has this rule. Again, I sit on the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee, where there's no such rule, and we've checked, and there's no rule like this anywhere else in Congress. This is not the appropriate committee to address this issue. House Rule 10, Clause 1K13 clearly states that jurisdiction on the administration of House office buildings belongs to the House Administration Committee, not the Committee on Natural Resources. I know that you all the Democrats have expressed a strong desire to keep our committee proceedings virtual, so there's not going to be too many people in the committee room. Hopefully that will change as we get further along with the pandemic. And with that said, whether or not any members on our side of the aisle choose to exercise their Second Amendment rights in this room, most of our Democrat colleagues won't be here to see it anyway. I believe that this amendment is deeper than, or this rule is deeper than just this committee, and that the Democrat majority seeks to restrict our Second Amendment rights on public lands across our nation and to erode those rights. While the majority may be successful in this hearing room, we will fight to ensure that our Second Amendment rights are protected outside these walls on public lands. Again, we recognize you're in the majority and you get to make the rules, but someday you won't be in the majority and we'll be making the rules. I'm pretty sure they won't contain provisions like this one that, again, is unique only to this committee. And I encourage everyone to take this rule out of the package and go back to the status quo, and that our rules would match rules with other committees. With that, I yield back.
Thank you very much. Gentleman yields. Anyone else want to be recognized on Mr. Westerman's amendment?
Yes, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Huffman, you're recognized, sir.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I wish this rule was not necessary. Unfortunately, it is. And I'm very familiar with the 1967 Capitol Police Board regulation that does create permission for members to bring guns in various parts of the Capitol. The only place that is off limits is the chamber and the areas immediately around the chamber. And we're even struggling to enforce that rule in this current elevated hyperventilating environment that we're all dealing with. So I wish we didn't have to bring up a potentially divisive subject like this, but here's the reality. If somebody wants to have a shrine to their gun fetish as a Zoom backdrop in their private life, they can do that. But this is our hearing room. And at some point, we will get past the COVID epidemic and we'll all start showing up in person, and our safety and our ability to conduct business civilly without feeling threatened is a relevant consideration, unfortunately. So I think it's necessary, not only appropriate, but necessary that we lay down these ground rules that whatever your fetishes or feelings are about guns, you're not going to bring them into our committee room. You don't need them there for your own safety. Many of us feel like it threatens our safety, and that's just not going to be allowed. And that's entirely appropriate and unfortunately necessary, Mr. Chairman. So I support this amendment. I support the rule, not the amendment.
Mr. Chairman, I would like to be recognized.
Mute.
Need to unmute, Mr. Chair.
Gentlelady is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. An in-person committee hearing would solve a lot of the issues that we're seeing today. Mr. Chairman, we all took an oath to uphold and secure the Constitution, every single one of us. Our first act as members of Congress was to take our oath of office. And please allow me to remind you a portion of that oath. The chair and every other member here solemnly swore that we would support and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic. The Second Amendment is very much a part of the Constitution of the United States. And so it doesn't matter how you feel, how you classify it. This is an enumerated right that American citizens have to keep and bear arms. Maybe some of you need to be reminded the Second Amendment says a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state. I know you don't like those words, necessary, security. Excuse me, I actually take those words back. A well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state. The right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. That ends in a period. There's no semicolon to follow that. There are no examples on when government can restrict these rights. So any clever proposition that comes after that is an infringement on our constitutional rights. As you've heard, other committees are not taking up similar rules. I also sit on the Budget Committee, and there's not a rule banning firearms from the hearing or conference rooms. How do you plan to enforce this, Mr. Chair? If there's no enforcement measures here, why have the rule? Will there be metal detectors installed outside the committee hearing doors? What is the procedure for delaying a vote as members get screened? Who is going to pay for these new metal detectors and increased security? Mr. Chairman, will you pay for this, or will the taxpayers cover these expenses? I would like to request at this time personal security detail that the chairman pays for himself for every time I step into the committee room. If this is passed, the chairman is trying to take responsibility for my personal safety while stripping away my Second Amendment rights. I don't want a security guard. I want personal security detail. I need personal security detail to protect each member that requests it. House Police has proven that they believe they need fences lined with miles of razor wire because there are those active threats against the Capitol complex. So if they want razor wire, fences, security, armed security, then we should be able to protect ourselves against these threats. And I want my own security detail. On January 6th, none of us were looking to our neighbors saying, gosh, I hope there are enough metal detectors outside. No, the Speaker of the House was whisked away safely while we were all left vulnerable and defenseless. That I would like to ask, will there be places to store firearms? I'm allowed to carry my firearm in the Capitol complex. So will there be a safe storage area for me to lock up my firearm once I'm disarmed by this committee's chairman? I believe that this is just messaging on the part of the Democrats. It is unconstitutional for members of Congress to be detained on their way to vote. With that, I would like to say, are there any other enumerated rights that will be nullified in this committee? Do we have the right to free speech here? The First Amendment secures our right of religious freedom. Are Bibles forbidden in this committee? Are hijabs, are crosses prohibited in this committee? Do we have the 14th Amendment? Are we not all equal under the law here in the Natural Resources Committee? How about the 19th Amendment? Can women vote in this committee? As a woman, I need to be certain this committee has no intention to take my right away to vote. Why do you think you could cherry pick? Why does anyone think that they could cherry pick the Second Amendment and say that this is the one enumerated right that we can take away from people? Why stop with the Second Amendment? Let's go ahead and quarter soldiers in this committee room. There's plenty of soldiers in the parking garage at Fort Pelosi in Washington, D.C. Let's go ahead and forget about due process while we're at it. That way we can unreasonably seize and search members of Congress before they enter the committee room. You know, kind of like what's going on in the House chambers right now. I urge my colleagues to think about this. If we don't protect our rights in Washington, D.C., there's little hope outside of Washington, D.C. for the American people to have those rights. This rule is absurd and is discriminative. Power grab of our constitutionally protected rights.
Chairman, I have Mr. Chairman.
Time's expired.
This is a blatant violation of our constitutional rights, and I yield.
Gentlelady's time's expired. Somebody else wish to be recognized on the amendment? If not, let me.
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to recognize, but I think I heard Mr. Sablon before me.
Mr. Sablon, you recognize, sir?
No.
I would like to be
sir,
recognized
I
as well.
I passed.
Mr. Graves?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I was a little concerned when I started out this meeting agreeing with you and agreeing with Mr. Huffman. I was concerned that was going to become a trend, and I'd have to go check myself a little bit. But certainly, I think that's where our agreement departs. Mr. Chairman, the gentlelady from Colorado points. Mr. Chairman, look, let's just talk practically speaking, not for the camera. Let's just be rational and practical for just a minute. The only way to get into the committee into the committee room is through the hallway on the floor of the Longworth building. That's the only way of getting into the committee room. Mr. Chairman, is there anything under this proposed amendment, the ranking member's amendment, that would prohibit our existing right to carry weapons in that hallway where every single member of the committee would have to pass in order to get into the committee room? I can answer that. The answer is no. So practically speaking, if this truly were a security measure that you or Mr. Huffman brought up, it would be wholly incomplete because the hallway, everybody could be armed. All the members could be armed. Secondly, Mr. Chairman, I ask another question. With this amendment, would it prohibit any weapons from being in the committee room? And the answer to that question is no. The bill does allow for law enforcement committee. And Mr. Chairman, while I back the blue all day long, and I know that those folks have gone through background checks, I'm going to take a guess that that the background checks that members of Congress go through is the most thorough that you could possibly go through. And while I may not agree with the sentiment or priorities of every member on this committee, including members on our side, I do believe that this is a right that is enshrined in the Constitution, that to suggest this is a security measure is a complete farce because folks could have weapons anywhere else. But most importantly, Mr. Chairman, while I say it again, I don't agree with everybody on this committee on our side or your side, I do trust in the public's confidence and faith that shown by electing these them. And I think that they should not be discriminated against, as the gentleman from Colorado noted, by restricting and taking away some of these rights. Guns are already allowed in the committee under this rule, Mr. Chairman, and I don't think that members that have gone through extraordinary scrutiny and scrutinized on a daily basis constitutional rights as a result of this rule, it can improve security. And I just think that this is really just, this is a farce. I mean, it is. This really is a game. I understand Mr. Huffman's concerns about being threatened. I get it, but this doesn't solve that problem if it were a true threat, which I don't think members truly pose a threat to their colleagues. And so I would urge, if this isn't the solution, I urge you to take a step back and figure out what it is. But choosing one committee in the Congress to take away the rights, I think is totally inappropriate. You are well aware that there have been more threats against members of Congress in the last 3 or 4 months than in the previous 10 years. And I think that this actually puts members' security at risk more than anything else, meaning this amendment. And so, Mr. Chairman, I urge adoption of the amendment. I want to make note to my friend from Colorado. I noted in her screen, I think just over your right shoulder, right about here, you've got room for one more handgun. If you can get it in that picture, you can get one more in there. But Mr. Chairman, I urge adoption of the amendment and yield back.
I'll work on that.
Gentleman yields back. Anyone else want to be recognized in the amendment?
Yes,
Yep.
Mr. Chairman.
Mr.
Gomer
Chairman,
here.
Mr. Chairman, could I ask that everybody mute their microphones when they're not speaking? There's a lot of feedback.
Right.
Thank you, Mr. Worcester. Mr. Gomer, you recognized?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Well, in the whole history of the Congress, there have always been firearms carried onto the House floor, carried into the Capitol. They were present back in the 1850s when there was a caning incident in the Senate. They've been present in the Capitol and on the House floor, in the Senate chamber. So this is, there was, as was mentioned earlier, express provision made for members of Congress back in '67. But really all that did was recognize the truth of what had gone on since the country began. Now, being one of only 2 members of the House who have been notified of being fined, not because I failed to go through the metal detectors and put all of my metal out. I did all of that, but because unlike the speaker who refused to go through the metal detector, went through the speaker's lobby and was not even wanted. I'd been through the metal detectors. I went across through the speaker's lobby to the restroom, watched by our Capitol Police, and then watched coming back. And for the first time since we'd had the metal detectors, I was told now there's another rule. You've got to be wanted coming back from the restroom, which is ridiculous. There's not even tanks on our toilets where you could hide a gun like happened in The Godfather. But regardless, it's very clear that's arbitrary and capricious. I have not carried a gun into committee. I am not guilty of violating a rule and carry a gun on the House floor. I'm guilty of arbitrary and capricious enforcement of a rule that was completely inappropriate and unnecessary. And as my friend from Colorado indicated, when there was a breach of the Capitol, the speaker was whisked away with lots of armed guards, whereas nobody else, unless they were in leadership, had that kind of protection. We're left on our own completely. And so it doesn't make sense to infringe upon the Second Amendment and members of Congress, because we're members of Congress, because we've gone through the scrutiny, as Mr. Graves indicated, that we're supposed to give up our Second Amendment rights in order to be members of Congress. That doesn't make sense. And hopefully the courts will direct that in the not too distant future. But this is so unnecessary. It's not been a problem in our committee in the past. It's not been a problem for the House in the past. So there's some kind of political machinations going at a higher level than the chairman or any of the rest of us. We ought to be able to have our hearings. We ought to be able to not have to give up our Second Amendment or First Amendment rights. Because we're members of Congress. We ought to be able to reflect the Constitution. We ought to be able to reflect, our districts. And that's what I believe the gentlelady from, or I may not can say lady, but the person from Colorado is exactly right. So I would urge support for her amendment. This is really just so unnecessary. It shouldn't be for our hearing. And so with that, urging vote yes on the amendment, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Anyone else wish to be recognized?
Mr. Chairman,
Who is seeking recognition?
you can't recognize me?
There you are, Mr. Young.
I thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just like to make, I want to support the gentlelady's amendment, and I agree with Mr. Gomer. I worry Mr. Huffman talking about being in danger. I go back to the history and talking about weapons. I happened to serve during Korea, and I was well trained in how to kill somebody with my hands. So Mr. Huffman, just keep that in mind. It's not weapons I'm talking about. I'm just suggesting respectfully, if we're going to have weapons, maybe we all have to come in with our hands tied together so we can't take and attack one another. And you've seen me in this committee, Mr. Huffman, the rest of you all this time, I get very angry. But I haven't attacked anybody. And the idea that now you're going to be protecting us from ourselves is really a divisive amendment as far as I'm rule. And I wish I listened to Mr. Gomer, he's absolutely right. I listened to Mr. Garrett, right? These type rules cause division within the committee. And, the other side, you're all strutting around now. We got the votes. Okay, but there is another time. That doesn't solve problems, nor can we do the job we're supposed to do. And that's being stewards of the public lands. We can debate that. But this is just a divisive wedge driven in the rules. I don't know where it came from. I can't believe you, Mr. Chairman, put it in. If it's coming from somebody else, then we ought to really think about it. Because this is a committee that's supposed to do good legislative work. And we start out this rules committee. I've been watching it in Alaska. I had to get up early to watch you guys. And having this thing go on like this is really will not have any working relationship. Yes, you got the votes, but it doesn't solve the problems of our public lands. So I'm just asking everybody to consider, don't have these stupid things in the rules that cause division. And I don't know where it's coming from. I have an idea where it is, but I'm not going to say it. I ask all my members, as former chairman of the, we never had that type of division. So I really feel badly about it. Why somebody wants to do this is just, what's the purpose? It's not about safety. Like I say, I was trained to do what I was supposed to do. I'm pretty good with what I have with into my elbows. So just keep that in mind. With that, I yield back.
Mr. Chairman, parliamentary inquiry.
Mr. Young?
I'm through. You back.
Parliamentary inquiry, Mr. Chairman.
Excuse me, Mr. Graves? Inquire?
Mr. Chairman, under the,
you have an
under
inquiry?
the new, my question is under the new rules where things are supposed to be gender neutral, if Mr. Gomer referred to the amendment sponsor as her amendment, and if Mr. Young referred to it as the gentle lady's amendment, and it was actually Bruce Westerman's amendment, would that violate the committee rules by referring to Westerman as a her or a gentle lady?
Mr. Chairman, we've got work to do.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Anyone else want to be seen on the amendment? Heard? I recognize myself. Current law prohibits firearms, dangerous weapons, explosive, incendiary devices within the Capitol complex with only very narrow exceptions. Again, this prohibition is just not in the House rules or policy or precedent, it's the law. The proposed committee rules that are before you in terms that this amendment tries to waive would repeat this requirement explicitly, and it is following those rules and restating them that I urge that the committee oppose the amendment, and I yield back. Anyone else? Any further discussion on the amendment?
The chairman is incorrect. That is not a law.
Does the gentle lady will ask to be recognized, please?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, that is not a law that
Point of order, Mr. Chairman. Point of order. Mr.
Point of
Chairman.
order. If the gentle lady is seeking time, somebody needs to yield to her. She's already spoken on this amendment.
Mr. Chairman, this is Jennifer Gonzalez asking for time.
If not,
I'll yield. I'll yield my time.
any further discussion on the amendment?
Mr. Chairman, this is Jennifer Gonzalez. I want to yield my time to the lady from Colorado.
I can't hear you. Who's
This is Jennifer Gonzalez, yielding my
Ms.
time.
Colon yields to the gentle lady from Colorado. Is that what's going on?
Thank you so much for yielding your time. The chairman is incorrect in saying that there is a law that prohibits firearms on the Capitol complex. The 1967 Act, which many members are familiar with, allows members of Congress to possess and carry firearms in the Capitol complex. The only place that those are prohibited is the House and Senate chambers. We have those rules in force now. So it is incorrect to say that that is a law that prohibits these items in the Capitol complex. In fact, if you were to carry a crossbow on your back into the committee room, that is perfectly legal within the Capitol complex. So if we need to go there, we most certainly could. But I could submit the 1967 Act into the record so the chairman could familiarize himself with it. With that,
Mr. Chairman, it's not an act, it's a regulation.
Mr. Chair.
The gentle lady from Puerto Rico yield back?
Yes, sir. I yield back.
Mr. Chair.
Who is seeks to be recognized?
This is McCollum.
McCollum, you're recognized.
Thank you, sir. I am fully informed on this issue and prepared to vote. Would it be proper to call for the question?
Yes. Gentle lady calls for the question. Here we know the question is on the Westerman Amendment number 1 to the proposed rules. I will pause so the members in favor of the amendment by Mr. Westerman can unmute. All those in favor?
Aye.
In favor indicate by saying aye.
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 Aye. Aye.
Members will mute themselves again. I will pause.
Young says aye.
Aye. Aye.
Aye.
Aye.
Is there anyone else that wish? Members will now mute themselves again, and I will pause so the members opposed to the amendment can unmute. All those opposed can indicate by saying no, no.
No.
No. No.
And the opinion of the chairs, the noes have it, and the amendment is not agreed to.
Mr. Chairman, I ask for a recorded vote.
The gentleman has asked for a recorded vote. The vote shall be postponed pursuant to the prior announcement. We now go, is Mr. Gosar prepared to be recognized for his amendment? Mr. Gosar, you're recognized for 5 minutes on your amendment.
This is just narrative.
What are the ones I have left to just give a list there?
Hey, Young, you need a mute.
Mr. Gosar? Let me move, Mr. Westerman, is there some point that you would want to offer Mr. Gosar's amendment, or are we clear on any technical problems he's having? It's inquiry, sir.
We heard he's back on, but if we can't hear him, we're prepared to offer for the amendment.
Okay.
Yeah.
I will move to Representative Harrell, the gentlelady from New Mexico, for her amendment, then go back to Gosar as the last one, if that's okay with you, Mr. Westerman.
That's good, Chairman. Thank you.
Thank you. Representative Harrell, you have the next amendment, and you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you.
This is a straightforward amendment that is intended to ensure that members of this committee have the ability to have their voices heard on the important issues surrounding budget reconciliation. As we all know, House Democrats are in the middle of crafting another spending bill through the budget reconciliation process intended to provide COVID-19 relief. This process is designed to cut out any need for Republican support. However, Republican and Democrat members alike have been able to participate in committee markups on various sections of the spending bill. In fact, I participated in an 8-hour-long markup in the Oversight and Reform Committee, where members were able to offer amendments to ensure adequate protection for babies born alive during abortion procedures and ensure that taxpayer money was being spent in the way that it was intended, just to name a few. Unfortunately, the majority on this committee has decided to abdicate their responsibility to mark up its section of the bill and give that responsibility to the Budget Committee. This robs members from both sides of this committee the opportunity to put forward amendments of importance to them and their constituents. For example, I would have offered an amendment related to the Biden ban on new oil and gas leasing on federal lands, which will have a devastating effect on my district and the state of New Mexico. Even our Senate counterparts were able to vote on important amendments that would be of interest to this committee. These include amendments related to President Biden's decision to revoke the permit for the Keystone XL pipeline, protecting the navigable waters rule, and providing a mechanism for school funding in the wake of the Biden oil and gas leasing ban. During future budget reconciliation deliberations, the Natural Resources Committee should not find itself in the position we are today, which is left out in the cold. The jurisdiction of this committee affects the daily lives of every one of our constituents, whether it be heating our homes, filling our cars, enjoying the outdoors, recreation, or providing access to our nation's treasures. The voice of this committee, and therefore the voice of our constituents, should be heard in crafting legislation with such large importance. This is why I offer this amendment today, and I ask that my colleagues empower this committee and vote for my amendment. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much. Lady yields, and anyone else wish to be recognized in this amendment?
Mr. Chair.
Who seeks recognition?
Mr. Chair, Stauber from Minnesota.
Sir, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I rise in support of my colleague's amendment. First of all, congratulations to Ranking Member Westerman and my colleagues Young, Gosar, Gonzalez, Colon, Fulcher, and Bentz, who are the other subcommittee Republican leads. I'm excited to get to work as the new ranking member of Energy and Mineral Resources. This is a responsibility I do not take lightly, and I look forward to rolling up my sleeves and going to work for Northern Minnesota and the rest of our country. We have a great Republican roster on our subcommittee, full of expertise on our economic drivers across this nation. So let's work together and support responsible development of America's natural resources to ensure a robust domestic supply chain, provide high wage and high quality jobs, and end our reliance on foreign sources that exploit child labor and seek to undermine our diplomacy abroad. Unfortunately, this committee has not gotten off to the right foot this Congress. The majority has yet to hold a single markup or hearing when other committees have, even when sent a reconciliation instruction. Representative Harrell, the vice ranking member of Energy and Minerals Resources, raises a very important issue with her amendment. Why are we turning over responsibility to another committee? Mr. Chair, $1 billion is a significant dollar amount. We need to hold a markup and debate these issues in our committee. Furthermore, this committee has already discharged several legislative items to the floor. Mr. Chair, let's not give away our authority. I hope this is not a practice that will continue, as it is our duty to transparently debate these crucial issues in our committee. Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Anyone else wish to be recognized on gentlelady's amendment?
Mr. Chairman.
Who seeks recognition?
Representative Soto.
Mr. Soto? Sir, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We, many of you may be on Energy and Commerce. Many more of you may not be. We had a 2-day markup on the energy section. The Energy and Commerce Committee, as you know, has prime jurisdiction over energy. And that section was debated for hours by Democrats and Republicans. But we know time is of the essence. Americans elected Joe Biden as president to go big on a major package to crush COVID, bring back prosperity. And so we are moving quickly on that. The chairman has discretion over this. And because time is of the essence, he felt this was the right thing to do. I certainly support him, and a lot of members on this committee got to debate there. Encourage all of you to aspire to potentially be not only on this committee, but on the Energy and Commerce Committee one day and have these debates. Your peers did well. It was a rigorous debate where we went over all these issues. And I certainly oppose the amendment and support the chair's continued discretion over these issues as we go forward.
Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yields. Mr. Westerman seeks recognition. Recognized, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Mr. Chairman, I would like to remind the members that this committee does have jurisdiction over energy and mineral development on federal lands, and our voices were not heard on this budget reconciliation bill. And there may be a few members on energy and commerce, but that doesn't negate the fact that we should have an open and transparent discussion in this committee, and we should offer input and amendments in this committee and not yield all of our jurisdiction to other committees. If we're going to do that, what's the purpose of even having this committee? So I hope that going forward, we may have missed the boat on being able to mark up this reconciliation bill, but there could be 2 more in the next 2 years. And I sure hope that we have hearings on those bills. And that's why I support the gentlelady's amendment and ask all members to support that, so that our voices can be heard and that our members can be represented, and that we can have a discussion about the issues that we have jurisdiction over in this Congress. I yield back.
Gentleman yields. Anyone else wish to be recognized?
Mr. Chairman.
Who seeks recognition?
Graves, Louisiana.
Mr. Graves.
Mr. Chairman, first of all, I take issue with the gentleman's comments from Florida's comments. This committee, as the ranking member noted, does not share in any way, shape, or form jurisdiction over upstream energy related to federal lands and waters. This committee has exclusive expertise and jurisdiction over that. The Energy and Commerce Committee did not mark up our portion of the bill. the $1 billion attributable to the Natural Resources Committee under the reconciliation package is exclusively our committee's jurisdiction. Number two, Mr. Chairman, the fact that markups could be held in other committees but not in this committee makes no sense. Why would it be appropriate to have a markup in other committees and not in our committee? You know, one of the key issues, and I predicted this. I talked about this last Congress, when the Great American Outdoors Act was being debated, Mr. Chairman, it was discussed that all of these activities, this billions of dollars, was going to be paid for from energy activities, from conventional energy production as well as renewable energy production. The reality is you can look at current projections based on executive orders, permitting actions, and others, is that funding target level under Great American Outdoors Act, something that I know you very much support, the land acquisition and the maintenance, that is in jeopardy. And so, you know, you can look back at what have we done? 5 COVID bills. I think the CARES Act was number 3. We did PPP Flexibility Act in May, number 4. We did I think we replenished PPP, and then we did the act back in December, became law December 27th. Every single one of those bills, Mr. Chairman, were bipartisan bills. They were bipartisan legislation that every member of the House was given an opportunity to act on. Why is it, if this is such an urgency? Look, the virus isn't partisan. It affects Republicans, Democrats, Independents. It affects all of us, every single one of us. All of us have constituents that have been infected. All of us have constituents that have been lost. And so to suggest that only Democrats, in reality, let's be honest what this is. You had 3 people write this bill. You had President Biden, you had Speaker Pelosi, and you had Chuck Schumer. 3 people wrote this bill, and not one other single member of the other 533 members of Congress are being given an opportunity to actually represent their constituents and have their priorities represented in this legislation. I think it's an awful precedent that this committee is setting. I'll say it again. Great American Outdoors Act, something I know is a priority of yours and other members. It is put in jeopardy by simply kicking this to other people that don't have the expertise on this. And so I urge adoption of the gentlelady's amendment and yield back.
Gentleman yields. Anyone else want to be recognized on the amendment? If not, I recognize myself for 5 minutes. I understand the minority's first assertion that they do not get to set the agenda for this committee. I have been in that minority position for more years than I want to remember. But the chair gets to decide what we mark up. That means consulting with chairs of subcommittees and other members and with the ranking member and to make some difficult compromises. But it's the chair's responsibility and the chair's authority. And I urge members to oppose the amendment and yield back my time. Is there any further discussion? Hearing no further debate, the question is on the Herald Amendment to the proposed rules. I will pause so the members in favor can unmute. All those in favor indicate by saying aye.
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 Members will please mute themselves again, and I will pause so that members who oppose can unmute. All those opposed indicate by saying no.
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 Members will mute again. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it. The noes have it, and the amendment is agreed to.
Mr. Chairman,
Yes.
I'd like to request a recorded vote, please.
The gentlelady has requested a recorded vote, and the vote should be postponed pursuant to the prior announcement. At this point, let me turn to Mr. Gosar for the final amendment. Mr. Gosar, you have the next amendment. You are recognized for 5 minutes, sir.
Mr. Chairman, I believe Mr. Gosar is having connectivity problems, so I ask unanimous consent that I be able to present the amendment on his behalf.
Without objection, Mr. Westerman, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And as you know, subpoenas are a very powerful investigatory and oversight tool. And that's why the committee rules have historically required votes by the members of this committee before issuance of any subpoenas. Such a powerful tool warrants at least concurrence with the ranking member to prevent abuse of power and undue harm to the individuals being subpoenaed. There's a big difference between using or issuing subpoenas for documents versus people. And there's even more significant differences in issuing subpoenas against government entities versus private citizens. These proposed committee rules for the 117th Congress make no distinction between papers and people and between public officials and private citizens. With unilateral power, the chairman could drag up to this committee anybody from a small town, an Alaska fisherman, to a private rancher in Arizona, to even employees of any company or nonprofit organization, with absolutely no discussion with any other member of this committee. The people we're talking about here are constituents in each of our own communities and districts. The rules as proposed today leave every one of our constituents vulnerable to the unchecked power of the chairman and potentially to all future chairmen of this committee. So I strongly encourage adoption of this amendment to the rules, and that we take a rational approach to subpoena power on the committee. And I yield back.
Thank you. Gentleman yields back. Anyone else want to be recognized on Mr. Gosar's amendment? If not, let me recognize myself. The proposed rules would codify a limited subpoena authority that already consists of significant concessions to the minority. Most House committee chairs have fully unilateral subpoena authority in their rules. Our committee in recent history has not. I opposed and continue to oppose subpoenas from the committee when there are good faith efforts to cooperate with our oversight work. But last Congress, in the face of the Trump administration unprecedented disrespect and obstruction for Congress and for this committee's request for information and the abuse of power, this committee updated its authority. With former ranking member Bishop, we negotiated a bipartisan compromise of concessions not found on most, if any, House committees, including extensive notice and even a mechanism for vetoing a decision by the chair to issue a subpoena. I have proactively offered to renew those concessions in our rules, and they're so. The opposition we're hearing today is an example, I think, sometimes of the minority being unable to take yes for an answer. They're now demanded even more in exchange for nothing. That's not how this works, and I urge members to reject the offer. I recommend, as I have in the past, that no subpoena will be issued without first giving the recipient ample time to provide information or testimony voluntarily, including extensive efforts to find compromise or address any privilege or other legitimate concerns, and that there would be knowledge, that there would be disclosure to all committee members relative to that subpoena effort. I do not intend to surprise or harass anybody. I do not intend for this committee to meet but I do intend for this committee to meet its constitutional responsibility to conduct oversight and investigations and to be informed when we're legislating, particularly in the times that we are confronting now, particularly in the aftermath of January 6th, the work of oversight and assuring accountability, restoring guardrails and transparency to the areas of jurisdiction that we have as an important function, an unfortunate necessity, and we will go forward with that. So I urge opposition to the amendment, and I yield back. Is there any further discussion on the amendment? Hearing no further debate, the question is on the Gosar Amendment number 1 to propose rules. I will pause so the members in favor can unmute. All those in favor indicate by saying aye.
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 All members will please mute themselves again, and I will pause so the members opposed can unmute. All those opposed say no. No.
No.
Members may mute again, and in the opinion of the chairs, the noes have it, and the amendment is not agreed to.
Mr. Chairman, I ask for a recorded vote.
The gentleman has asked for a recorded vote, and we will. What time is it now? Right now, we were going to recess for till 1 o'clock Eastern time, in order to allow all the members, that need to vote to be here. And with that, we will reconvene at that time for the, roll votes and the vote on the rules. With that, committee's in recess. Is reconvened. The recorded votes have been requested on 3 amendments. We will deal with those now. Let me say that members are reminded that under House regulations, members must be visible to the chair in order to vote. There is no exception for even for technical issues. If a member is visible but without sound, they may visually vote with thumbs up, thumbs down. Members should answer the clerk by stating your name and then your vote. This allows the camera enough time to switch to you and reduce any confusion. The question is on the amendment designated Westerman number 1. The clerk will read the names of, the clerk shall call the roll.
Mr. Grijalva,
No.
Mr. Grijalva votes no.
Please hold on.
Mr. Westerman,
I'm on a Zoom call and my phone is tied up, so I'll call you later. Thank you.
Mrs. Napolitano. Mrs. Napolitano?
No. No.
Mrs. Napolitano, I don't see a visual. Can I see you on video, please? Mrs. Napolitano votes no. Mr. Young? Mr. Costa?
Mr. Costa, no.
Mr. Costa votes no. Mr. Sablan? One. Mr. Huffman? Mr. Whitman? Mr. Lowenthal?
Ms. Lowenthal votes no.
Mr. Lowenthal votes no. Mr. McClintock?
Aye.
Mr. McClintock votes aye. Mr. Gallego?
Votes no.
No.
Gosar? Mr. Gosar? Mr. Nagus?
No.
Mr. Nagus votes no. Graves?
Congressman Cohen.
Votes yes. Graves votes yes.
Mr. Graves votes aye. Levin?
Levin votes no.
Mr. Levin votes no. Mr. Heiss?
Heiss votes yes.
Mr. Heiss votes aye. Ms. Porter?
No. Porter votes no.
Ms. Porter votes no. Mrs. Radewagen? Ms. Leger Fernandez?
Leger Fernandez votes no.
Ms. Leger Fernandez votes no. Mr. Webster?
Mr. Webster votes yes.
Mr. Webster votes aye. Ms. Velasquez?
Ms. Velasquez votes no.
Velasquez votes no. Ms. Gonzalez Colon?
Gonzalez Colon votes aye.
Ms. Gonzalez Colon votes aye. Ms. DeGette?
DeGette votes no.
Ms. DeGette votes no. Mr. Fulcher?
Fulcher votes aye.
Mr. Fulcher votes aye. Ms. Brownlee?
Miss Brownlee votes no.
Ms. Brownlee votes Ms. Brownlee votes no. Mr. Stober?
Mr. Stauber votes yes.
Mr. Stabber votes aye. Mrs. Dingle?
Dingle votes no.
Mrs. Dingle votes no. Mr. Tiffany?
Tiffany votes aye.
Mr. Tiffany votes aye. Mr. McEachin? Mr. Carl?
Mr. Carl votes aye. Yes.
Mr. Carl votes aye. Mr. Soto?
Soto votes no.
Mr. Soto votes no. Mr. Rosendale?
Rosendale votes yes.
Mr. Rosendale votes aye. Mr. San Nicolas?
San Nicolas votes no.
Mr. San Nicolas votes no. Mr. Moore?
Mr. Moore votes aye.
Mr. Moore votes aye. Mr. Garcia?
Garcia votes no.
Mr. Garcia votes no. Ms. Harrell?
Ms. Harrell votes yes.
Ms. Harrell votes aye. Mr. Case?
Case votes no.
Mr. Case votes no. Mrs. Boebert?
Boebert votes aye.
Mrs. Boebert votes aye. Ms. McCollum?
No.
Ms. McCollum votes no. Mr. Obernolte?
Obernolte, aye.
Mr. Obernolte votes aye. Mr. Cohen?
Cohen votes no.
Mr. Cohen votes no. Mr. Bentz?
Mr. Benz votes aye.
Mr. Bentz votes aye. Mr. Tonko?
Tonko votes no.
Mr. Tonko votes no. Ms. Talib?
Talib votes no.
Ms. Talib votes no. Ms. Matsui?
Matsui votes no.
Ms. Matsui votes no. Ms. Trahan?
Trahan votes no.
Ms. Trahan votes no.
How is Mr. Gosar recorded? Gosar votes yes.
Mr. Gosar has not been recorded.
Yes. Gosar votes yes.
Mr. Gosar votes aye.
Westerman is an aye as well.
Yeah. Mr. Westerman votes aye.
And I never heard.
No.
Mr. Chair, can we do another roll call for all these members?
The clerk read the names of any members that are not recorded. If the clerk would.
Yes. Mr. Young? Mr. Young? Mr. Gomert?
Yeah, I didn't hear my name or Young's name originally called. I'm an aye. Thumbs up, aye for Gomer.
Mr. Gomert votes aye. Mr. Sablan?
Sablan votes no.
Mr. Sablan votes no. Mr. Lamborn? Mr. Huffman?
Huffman, no.
Mr. Huffman votes no. Mr. Whitman? Mr. Whitman? Mrs. Radawagon?
Radawagon, aye.
Mrs. Radawagon votes aye. Mr. McEachin?
Are there members who wish to vote that haven't voted or to change their vote? If not, the vote is closed and the clerk shall report.
Mr. Chair, on this vote, the yeas are 19 and the nays are 25.
The amendment fails and the amendment to the rules package fails and we move on to amendment designated Harold number 1. If the clerk will read the names, if the clerk would the roll, please.
Mr. Grijalva?
No.
Mr. Grijalva votes no. Mr. Westerman?
Aye.
I have to vote.
Aye.
Mr. Westerman votes aye. Mrs. Napolitano?
Napolitano, no.
Mrs. Napolitano votes no. Mr. Young. Mr. Young. Mr. Costa.
Mr. Costa votes no.
Mr. Costa votes no. Mr. Gomert.
Aye.
Mr. Gomert votes aye. Mr. Sablan.
Sablan votes no.
Mr. Sablan votes no. Mr. Lamborn. Mr. Lamborn. Mr. Huffman.
Huffman, no.
Mr. Huffman votes no. Mr. Whitman. Mr. Whitman. Mr. Lowenthal.
Lowenthal, no.
Mr. Lowenthal votes no. Mr. McClintock.
Aye.
Mr. McClintock votes aye. Mr. Gallego.
Gallego votes no.
Mr. Gallego votes no. Mr. Gosar.
Yes.
Mr. Gosar votes aye. Mr. Neguse.
No.
Mr. Neguse votes no. Mr. Graves.
Yes.
Mr. Graves votes aye. Mr. Levin.
Levin votes no.
Mr. Levin votes no. Mr. Heiss.
Heiss votes yes.
Mr. Heiss votes aye. Ms. Porter.
Miss Porter votes no.
Ms. Porter votes no. Mrs. Radewagen.
Radewagen, aye.
Mrs. Radewagen votes aye. Ms. Leger Fernandez.
Leger Fernandez votes no.
Ms. Leger Fernandez votes no. Mr. Webster.
Webster votes yes.
Mr. Webster votes aye. Ms. Velasquez.
Ms. Velasquez votes no.
Ms. Velasquez votes no. Ms. Colon. Gonzalez Colon votes aye. Ms. Gonzalez Colon votes aye. Ms. DeGette.
DeGette votes no.
Ms. DeGette votes no. Mr. Fulcher.
Votes aye.
Mr. Fulcher votes aye. Ms. Brownlee.
Miss Brownlee votes no.
Ms. Brownlee votes no. Mr. Stauber.
Stauber votes yes.
Mr. Stauber votes aye. Mrs. Dingle.
Dingle votes no.
Mrs. Dingle votes no. Mr. Tiffany.
Tiffany votes aye.
Mr. Tiffany votes aye. Mr. McEachin. Mr. McEachin. Mr. Carl.
Carl votes aye. Yes.
Mr. Carl votes aye. Mr. Soto.
Votes no.
Mr. Soto votes no. Mr. Rosendale.
Rosendale votes yes.
Mr. Rosendale votes aye. Mr. San Nicolas.
San Nicolas votes no.
Mr. San Nicolas votes no. Mr. Moore.
Mr. Moore is aye.
Mr. Moore votes aye. Mr. Garcia.
Garcia votes no.
Mr. Garcia votes no. Ms. Harrell.
Ms. Harrell votes aye.
Ms. Harrell votes aye. Mr. Case.
Case votes no.
Mr. Case votes no. Mrs. Boebert.
Boebert votes aye.
Mrs. Boebert votes aye. Ms. McCollum.
McCollum votes no.
Ms. McCollum votes no. Mr. Obernolte.
Obernolte votes aye.
Mr. Obernolte votes aye. Mr. Cohen.
Cohen votes no.
Mr. Cohen votes no. Mr. Benz?
Mr. Benz votes aye.
Mr. Benz votes aye. Mr. Tonko?
Co votes no.
Mr. Tonko votes no. Ms. Talib?
Talib votes no.
Ms. Talib votes no. Ms. Matsui?
Matsui votes no.
Ms. Matsui votes no. Ms. Trahan?
Trahan votes no.
Ms. Trahan votes no.
The Will the clerk read the names of any members that have not been recorded?
Mr. Young? Mr. Young? Mr. Lamborn? Mr. Woodman? Mr. McEachin?
Are there any members who wish to vote that have not voted or to change their vote? If not, the vote is closed and the clerk shall report.
Mr. Chair, on this vote, the yeas are 19. The yeas are 19, the nays are 25.
The nays have it. The amendment to the rule package fails. And now we move on to amendment designated Ms. Gosar number 1. The clerk will call the roll, please.
Mr. Grijalva?
No.
Mr. Grijalva votes no. Mr. Westerman?
Westerman votes aye.
Mr. Westerman votes aye. Mrs. Napolitano?
Napolitano, no.
Mrs. Napolitano votes no. Mr. Young? Mr. Costa?
Costa votes no.
Mr. Costa votes no. Mr. Gomert?
Gomer votes aye.
Mr. Gomert votes aye. Mr. Sablan?
Sablan votes no.
Mr. Sablan votes no. Mr. Lamborn? Mr. Huffman?
Huffman, no.
Mr. Huffman votes no. Mr. Whitman? Mr. Lowenthal?
Lowenthal votes no.
Mr. Lowenthal votes no. Mr. McClintock?
Aye.
Mr. McClintock votes aye. Mr. Gallego?
Gallego votes no.
Mr. Gallego votes no. Mr. Gosar?
Yes.
Mr. Gosar votes aye. Mr. Neguse?
No.
Mr. Neguse votes no. Mr. Graves?
Yes.
Mr. Graves votes aye. Mr. Levin?
Levin votes no.
Mr. Levin votes no. Mr. Heiss?
Did you say Heiss?
Mr. Heiss?
Yes, Heiss votes yes.
Mr. Heiss votes aye. Miss Porter?
No, Porter votes no.
Miss Porter votes no. Mrs. Radowagon?
Radowagon, aye.
Miss Radowagon votes aye. Miss Leger Fernandez?
Leger Fernandez votes no.
Miss Leger Fernandez votes no. Mr. Webster?
Webb, yes.
Mr. Webster votes aye. Ms. Velasquez?
Ms. Velasquez votes no.
Ms. Velasquez votes no. Ms. Gonzalez-Colon?
Cologne votes aye.
Ms. Gonzalez-Colon votes aye. Ms. DeGette?
DeGette votes no.
Ms. DeGette votes no. Mr. Fulcher?
Fulcher is aye.
Mr. Fulcher votes aye. Ms. Brownlee?
Ms. Brownlee votes no.
Ms. Brownlee votes no. Mr. Stauber?
Stauber votes aye.
Mr. Stauber votes aye. Mrs. Dingle?
Dingle votes no.
Mrs. Dingle votes no. Mr. Tiffany?
Tiffany votes aye.
Mr. Tiffany votes aye. Mr. McEachin? Mr. Carl?
Carl votes aye, yes.
Mr. Carl votes aye. Mr. Soto?
No.
Mr. Soto votes no. Mr. Rosendale?
Rosendale votes yes.
Mr. Rosendale votes aye. Mr. San Nicolas?
San Nicolas votes no.
Mr. San Nicolas votes no. Mr. Moore? Mr. Garcia?
And then, yeah.
Tia votes no.
Thank you.
Mr. Garcia votes no. Ms. Harrell?
Ms. Harrell votes aye.
Ms. Harrell votes aye. Mr. Case?
Case votes no.
Mr. Case votes no. Mrs. Boebert?
Boebert votes aye.
Mrs. Boebert votes aye. Ms. McCollum?
McCollum votes no.
Ms. McCollum votes no. Mr. Obernolte?
Obernolte votes aye.
Mr. Obernolte votes aye. Mr. Cohen?
Cohen votes no.
Mr. Cohen votes no. Mr. Bentz?
Mr. Benz votes aye.
Mr. Bentz votes aye. Mr. Tonko?
Tonko votes no.
Mr. Tonko votes no. Ms. Talib?
Talib votes no.
Ms. Talib votes no. Ms. Matsui?
Matsui votes no.
Ms. Matsui votes no. Ms. Trahan?
Trahan votes no.
Ms. Trahan votes no.
The clerk will read any names of any members that are not recorded.
Mr. Young? Mr. Lamborn? Mr. Whitman? Mr. McEachin? Mr. Moore?
Aye.
Mr. Moore votes aye.
Are there any members who wish to vote that have not voted or changed their votes? If not, the vote is closed and the clerk shall report.
Mr. Chair, on this vote, the yeas are 19 and the nays are 25.
The amendment to the rules package fails. The nays have it, and we move on to the question of final passage. The question is now the adoption of the rules package as amended. I will pause so that members in favor can unmute. All those in favor of the rules package as amended indicate by saying aye. Aye.
Aye.
Aye.
Aye.
Members will please mute themselves again, and I will pause so that members opposed can unmute. All those opposed say no.
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 Members will mute again. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The ayes have it, and the rules are adopted as amended, and the motion to reconsider is laid on the table. And returning, before we adjourn the appointment, the last item of consideration is the appointment of Democratic and Republican committee staff under House rules. The staff appointment resolution has been noticed and circulated. Without objection, the resolution is adopted and the committee staff are appointed. I ask unanimous consent that the staff be allowed to make any technical and conforming changes to the rules and the committee resolution just adopted, subject to the approval of the minority. Let me turn to the ranking member if he has, he wishes to be recognized on his motion regarding the views of the minority. If not, let me thank you and so much for the.
Mr. Chairman, point of privilege, please. This is Ms. Brownlee.
Ms. Brownlee, please, recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I just wanted to send my best wishes to Jared Huffman. It's his birthday today.
Son of a gun. Happy birthday, Jared.
Did you really just say son of a gun, Mr. Chairman? You son of a gun, did you say that?
Yes, I did.
Take it back. Can we sing a happy birthday song?
I know that was maybe a Freudian slip on my part. So I want to thank all of you for your patience.
Mr. Chairman, point of privilege, this is Ms. Bober.
Let me just close by thanking you for your patience and for being here.
Chairman, point of privilege, this is Ms. Bober.
Somebody's trying to.
Who wishes to be recognized? Point of privilege.
This is Lauren Bober.
Recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I do want to wish Representative Huffman a very happy birthday. He had a lovely tinfoil birthday hat, as I guess our Second Amendment rights are a conspiracy. But I do want to express my disappointment in the 25 Democrats who are now on the record violating their oath of office by stripping the Second Amendment rights. And as a female, I am now deeply concerned that this committee will in the future strip away my right as a woman to vote. It's very clear that none of our enumerated rights are secure in this committee. And with that, I yield.
And, with that, let me thank all of you for your patience and for being here. And as we, in the general question of intent of the chair and of the committee, let me be very clear about intent in terms of where this committee. I think in the spirit of transparency and honesty and dealing with the ranking member, who I appreciate his considerations. This committee has significant work ahead of it, significant markups. The subcommittees will bring forth initiatives that deal with issues as critical as climate change, transparency in general, issues of environmental justice, a robust oversight, the reestablishment of science as a premise for decision making, reintroducing the conservation ethic to our public assets around dealing with the budget, and employee retention and morale, and the need to repair a storied department that needs repair, and then to rebuild it better. The times that we're in are unusual. The situations require urgency, and I think they require bold action. That's the intent of this committee, to move forward. And I hope that as we go forward, that there is room for bipartisanship. I certainly will seek that. But the critical questions facing the American people, particularly on such overriding issues such as climate change, require this committee to act and to present to the full House of Representatives some significant legislative initiatives that would make our function part of a solution instead of continuing to be part of a problem. That's the intent. And histrionics aside, the work ahead is important. I look forward to it. I'm emboldened by the members of the committee, their expertise and what they bring to it. And with that, There's no further business. The committee is adjourned. Thank you very much.